bucka. Ha. You know the deal.
The next thing we're going to talk about in our probability unit is about making predictions based on the probability of an outcome of an experiment happening. So in the last video we talked about how to express probability, and usually we express probability as a fraction. Since it can be expressed as a fraction, it could also be expressed as a percent or a decimal, but for the most part we're going to leave it as a fraction. So just to review, the probability of getting heads when you flip a coin is 1 out of 2. And the reason it's 1 out of 2 is because there are 2 total possible outcomes that could happen. You can get heads or you can get tails. And that's what goes in the denominator. And in the numerator is the number of favorable outcomes, which is just getting heads. And what we're going to talk about here is what this fraction actually really means. And what it really means is if we flip a coin 2 times, we're going to get heads about 1 time. Now, probability is not a guarantee. So if we flip a coin twice, we're not guaranteed to get heads once. But the probability is that for every 2 times we flip a coin, we should get heads about 1 of those times. So what we can say is half of the time that we flip a coin, we will get heads. Now remember, this is a prediction. It's not a guarantee. If you flip a coin a certain number of times, the probability is you will get heads about half of those times. So because of that, well, we can make predictions about how many times we're going to get heads based on how many times we flip a coin. And all we need to know is how many times are we going to flip the coin. And once we know that, what we do is we change this sentence here into a math sentence. So suppose we flip a coin 250 times. Well, in order to predict about how many times we're going to get heads, we're going to use the probability here of getting heads, and we're going to translate what we have here into a math sentence. So half of the time we flip a coin, which here the amount of times that we're flipping a coin is 250. As we've talked about in operations and translating English sentences into math sentences, usually if we see that word of, it means multiply. So it's a half times 250. And in order to multiply fractions, we multiply straight across, numerator by numerator, denominator by denominator. We could reduce in the question here if we wanted to, but I'll just go ahead and multiply 250 times 1 and 2 times 1. And when we simplify that, 250 over 2, or 250 divided by 2, is 125. So if we flip a coin 250 times, we're predicting that we're going to get heads about 125 times. Now you might be asking, why did I go through all this trouble of multiplying 1 over 2 times 250 when most people, if they were asked for half of something, they would simply divide it by 2. And you'd be right in this case. If you divide 250 by 2, you will get 125. Understanding how that word of means multiplying and solving in this way can help when our fraction is something other than half. And we're going to look at a couple of examples like that next. So suppose our experiment involved rolling a die. And suppose we're going to roll a dice 600 times. And the question we want answered is, well, about how many times will we get a 2 or a 5? In order to make this prediction, the first thing we need to figure out is what's the probability of getting a 2 or a 5? Well, as discussed in the last video, when we're expressing probability, it's expressed as a fraction. In the denominator is going to go the total number of possible outcomes, which when we're rolling a dice is 6. And in the numerator is our number of favorable outcomes. Here we want a 2 or a 5. So I have 2 favorable outcomes, those 2 out of the possible 6, and if we reduce that fraction, it reduces to 1 over 3. So now that we know the probability of getting a 2 or a 5, as we saw in the last example, well, that means that if I repeat this experiment over and over again, I can expect to get my favorable outcome here, which is a 2 or a 5, about a third of the time, or a third of 600 times. And a third of 600 means a third times 600. So once again, we've got our fractions here where we multiply straight across. I mean, there are other ways to simplify this, but this is one way. And we end up with 600 divided by 3, which is 200. So the answer to the question here is, if we roll the dice 600 times, we're going to get a 2 or a 5 about 200 of those times. So here's another example where we've got an experiment where we're now spinning a spinner. And the question here is, if you spin the spinner 250 times, about how many times will you land on blue or green? Now, the spinner is broken into 5 pieces. Let's assume they're all the same size pieces, so let's assume that this is a fair experiment. And as we've seen with the previous 2 examples, the first question we have to answer is, well, what's the probability of getting blue or green? So we're going to look at this word "or" here again, just like we did in the last video. And as hopefully you remember, when we want to know the probability of getting blue or green, we take the probability of each one, which is 1 out of 5. The probability of getting blue is 1 out of 5. The probability of getting green is 1 out of 5. And when we see that word "or," usually means we're adding the probabilities together. So the probability of getting blue or green is 2 out of 5. And again, we could verify that by the fact that there's still 5 possible outcomes, and 2 of them are favorable outcomes here. So the probability of getting blue or green is 2 out of 5, which means that we're going to get blue or green about 2/5 of the time. So 2/5 of 250 times in this case. And here's where you can see where we have an example where when you have to find a fraction of a number, understanding that "of" really means multiply comes in handy to find 2/5 of 250. So 2 times 250 is 500, and then over 5 means divided by 5. So we can predict that if we spin this spinner 250 times, we're going to get blue or green about 100 times. So to finish off our lesson on making predictions, I'm going to ask you to make a few predictions of your own. 4 of them, in fact. So for each one of these, just as we've seen in the previous few examples, first thing you need to do is figure out the probability of getting your favorable event. So for question number A, your favorable event is getting an even number if you roll the dice. So first thing is get the probability of doing that. And then once you have that, you take the number of times that you repeat the experiment, which again for question A is 1,000 times, and you multiply it by the probability. And you can predict about how many times you get that favorable outcome. If you're able to do that, congratulations. You now have a firm understanding of how to make predictions based on the probability of an event.